Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Cal CCA's Community Energy Innovation webinar series. We're excited to bring you today's webinar focusing on integrating environmental stewardship principles into power procurement. I'm Leora Vestal, Cal CCA's Director of Communications. Also here as part of the webinar team is Sandra McCafferty, Administrative Coordinator at Cal CCA. Thank you to our webinar series sponsor, Calpine Energy Solutions. Calpine partners with community choice energy programs throughout California, providing customer and data management, call center, risk reporting, and other key services. An early supporter of CCA in California, Calpine now counts 17 aggregators as clients. The company's sponsorship funding will go directly to charities around the state that are providing relief to communities most impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Before we start, I want to introduce today's speakers. Natasha Kiefer is Director of Power Planning and Procurement at Clean Power Alliance. Natasha's experience includes sustainable infrastructure development, energy finance, utility planning and procurement, and launching new enterprises. Natasha previously served as Vice President of Energy and Water Development at Renewable Resources Group, an impact investment firm, where she was the lead for infrastructure project development and investment activities in the Western United States, South America, and Australia. Erica Brand serves as the Energy Strategy Director for the California chapter of the Nature Conservancy, where she leads a team that focuses on decarbonizing the grid and providing science and policy analysis to state and federal regulatory agencies that develop and implement clean electricity policies and solutions. Erica serves as co-chair of the Board of Directors of the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies. Before joining the Nature Conservancy, she served as a senior environmental policy specialist at PG&E. Today's webinar is being recorded and all participants will be in listen-only mode. Please use the Q&A button on your screen to type in questions. A Q&A with our speakers will follow after the presentations. Take it away, Natasha.
Thank you, Lyra. So today we'll be talking about incorporating environmental stewardship principles into power procurement decision-making. And environmental stewardship is an important topic because California is planning a monumental energy transition over the next few decades. Under SB 100, California is targeting achieving 100% clean energy by 2045. And CCAs are going to be a critical force in that transformation. CCAs provide a voice for their local communities in this energy transition, with many CCAs having local goals that actually exceed state mandates. So you see this chart on the right, this shows a snapshot of the CCA procurement of new renewable resources throughout the state. To date, CCAs have signed over 3,600 megawatts of new clean energy PPAs. And this chart is likely already out of date because California CCAs are signing new contracts every day. CCAs have and will continue to make significant investments in clean energy, which will have an impact not only on GHG reduction in the state, but also have an impact on land use and the environment. Next slide. So before we dive into that topic more, I just wanted to introduce Clean Power Alliance and the procurement that we've been doing. So Clean Power Alliance, CPA, we are organized as a joint powers authority. We have 32 member jurisdictions within LA, and Ventura counties, which you can see in this graphic. We have 30 member agencies that are cities, and then we represent the areas of LA County and Ventura County unincorporated. We're a fairly new organization. We launched service to customers in February of 2018, and this is our third year of operation. We serve both residential and non-residential customers, so commercial and industrial customers as well. And we serve about 1 million customer accounts. This makes us both the largest CCA in the state and also the 5th largest load serving entity in the state. And I'll note here that we operate within SoCal Edison service territory. So Clean Power Alliance, we offer choices through the products that we offer our customers. We offer our customers 3 product types: a lean power product, which is approximately the same RPS content as SCE's base rate. And it's offered to customers at a slight discount to SCE's base rate. We offer a clean power product, which is a 50% renewable energy content at parity to SCE's base rate. And then we also offer our customers 100% green power product, which is 100% renewable energy content, and that's offered at a premium to SCE's base rate. And I'll note that the majority of customers we're serving are on the clean or 100% green rates, with about a quarter of our customers on the 100% green rate. So what does this mean for procurement? This is important for procurement because of that product customer mix. We're already about 60% renewable on our overall portfolio, which means that we're already hitting our 2030 RPS goal 10 years ahead of schedule. And it means that we have a very large renewable energy demand that we have to fill based on our customers' demand. So this is an overview of CPA's procurement to date. To support that high customer renewable energy demand, as well as to support our community's environmental goals and to help the state achieve its environmental goals, we are engaging in procurement of long-term resources. To date, CPA's board has approved 10 long-term clean energy contracts that you can see in this table. And we have many hundreds of additional megawatts still in negotiation that we hope to be bringing to our board for approval over the next few months. You can see here that this list includes a diverse range of technologies, including wind, solar, RPS certified small hydro, and storage resources, with about 800 megawatts of renewables and 288 megawatts of storage. So although we're a relatively new organization, we have been doing a lot of procurement to date. Next slide. So how do we actually procure these resources? So we procure RPS certified long-term contracts and long-term storage resources via an annual RFO, request for offers, or through bilateral negotiations. And when we ran our initial 2018 clean energy RFO, during this RFO, our board established evaluation criteria that we use to evaluate all of our projects. And those criteria includes an environmental stewardship principle and an evaluation criteria, which I'll talk about more. And we use these standard evaluation criteria to evaluate all of our long-term contracts. The 2018 evaluation process worked really well. So we used the same evaluation process in our 2019 clean energy RFO. And we're going to be incorporating the same approach in our 2020 clean energy RFO, which we're planning to release later this year in October. And just to note for folks in the audience, we're going to be sending out information about this upcoming RFO via our distribution list. So if you're interested, please sign up for our distribution list on the cleanpoweralliance.org website. So this slide shows the 6 evaluation criteria that we use to assess projects. And I think the big takeaway here is that CCAs differ from other load serving entities because we don't just care about getting contracts signed. We really do care about the impact of the projects and want to select projects that our communities are going to be proud of. So here you can see the 6 evaluation criteria we use. The first is value. So this is the economic value to CPA over the term of the contract. And of course, we want to select projects that are going to be a strong value to our customers. But in addition to that, we have 5 other criteria that reflect the priorities and concerns of our communities. That includes environmental stewardship. That's going to be the topic of today's discussion. But we also include other criteria like workforce development, development risk, and development risk includes a variety of concerns, including interconnection status, permitting, site control, project financing, and developer experience, because we really want to make sure that the projects that we select are going to be successful and come online. We also include project location. So CPA has a preference for projects that are located within our service territory, and we also distinguish between projects that are located in state versus out of state. And then the last is benefits to disadvantaged communities. And prior to our first RFO, as we were establishing these criteria, we had a unique opportunity to partner with the Nature Conservancy and other community stakeholders to craft this evaluation approach. TNC was really instrumental in our approach to incorporating environmental stewardship into the selection process. And to talk about this more, I will introduce Erica, who can speak to the Nature Conservancy and environmental stewardship overall.
Thank you, Natasha. Hi, everyone. I'm Erica. And as Leora mentioned, I currently serve as the Director of the Energy Strategy for the Nature Conservancy in California. And here I lead a team that works to advance California's transition to a low carbon economy while protecting ecologically important lands and waters. TNC is the largest conservation organization in the world. We work in 79 countries and all 50 states. We started more than 60 years ago, and in that time, we've protected more than 120 million acres around the world. But the world and the challenges we face look very different today. Climate change is one of the world's most urgent challenges and is an immediate risk to our communities, economies, and TNC's mission. To address this challenge, over the past 10 years, our California team has partnered with a wide range of stakeholders to develop a collaborative and science-driven approach to deploying clean energy. Together, we have worked to inform new planning and procurement approaches, develop policy, and create incentives to scale clean energy and transmission infrastructure while protecting critical lands and waters. Next slide, please. We're living in an exciting time for clean energy and climate progress. Establishing ambitious clean energy goals is an essential first step to driving policy frameworks that can enable the technological solutions necessary to mitigate and slow the worst impacts of climate change. But after the clean energy goals are set, comes the question of how to get there, including where to build the clean energy infrastructure needed to achieve our ambitious goals. The challenge that we must solve for is that potentially up to 75 million acres could be needed for clean energy development across the United States. Next slide. That's roughly equal to 100 Yosemite National Parks, from the Valley to Tuolumne Meadows to the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias. That's a lot of infrastructure to site and build over the next 2 decades. And if not sited in an approach that's smart from the start, a lot of ecologically important natural and agricultural lands could be at risk. Next slide. Here in California, we've studied the land area requirements for new electricity infrastructure extensively, which I'll share more about in a couple of minutes. It will take collaboration across electricity service providers, non-governmental organizations, energy companies, and regulatory agencies to solve for the many challenges of decarbonizing our economy, including where to build clean energy infrastructure quickly and with less impact to nature. Next slide. And that's important because place matters in clean energy build-out. We're fortunate to have many different types of clean energy resources here in the West to decarbonize our grid. And the costs have fallen dramatically over the years. All energy development has an impact on the environment that needs to be managed. While most clean energy technologies don't have the same air, greenhouse gas, and water pollution impacts as conventional energy, one impact of utility scale clean energy facilities that needs to be proactively managed is the footprint. That's because the land area required for some types of clean energy, solar and wind, for example, are much higher per megawatt than other technologies. These types of clean energy facilities can require hundreds or thousands of acres per project, and if not put in the right places, can break up important habitats, sever wildlife corridors, and interfere with migration, and in the case of resources like hydro, impact rivers. However, the land requirements of renewables should not deter progress. Through the appropriate policy and planning frameworks, clean energy can produce electricity that is low emission, low cost, and low impact to natural lands. Next slide. To understand what the clean energy and infrastructure development pathways to 2050 for California could look like, and if they can be done while limiting impacts to natural and agricultural lands, the Nature Conservancy partnered with E3, Energy and Environmental Economics, on this study called The Power of Place. And it was guided by this central question: can the high renewable build required to achieve California's deep decarbonization goals in 2050 be done while limiting impacts to natural and agricultural lands across the West? Next. We didn't only want to study getting the electricity sector to SB 100 goals. We wanted to study the clean energy infrastructure needed for economy-wide deep decarbonization, because on that pathway, studies have projected a near doubling of electricity demand by mid-century to support widespread electrification. Next slide. The infographic seen here depicts the 61 scenarios and sensitivities that TNC explored with E3 in the Power of Place study. And there are two sensitivities that I want to highlight for today's discussion. The first, in the upper left-hand corner, is geography. We explored 3 different geographies from within which renewable energy resources are assumed to be available to California. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later. The second sensitivity that I want to highlight is level of land protection. We were able to study 4 different sensitivities that allow us to understand, with an increasing emphasis on land protection to reduce impacts, how does that change the generation mix and the costs? Next slide. One important finding from this work is that in 2050, the scale of new wind and solar across the scenarios ranged from 1.6 million to 3.1 million acres. Next slide. And now I'm going to show you what that could look like using a visualization of a subset of the 2050 scenarios that we studied. Next slide, please. Pictured here on left is utility scale solar development in California through 2018. It's roughly 87,000 acres. And on the right, we show one of the California in-state scenarios and the utility scale wind and solar resources that were selected by the models. And what stands out is that in this particular scenario, there are around 1.2 million acres needed for utility scale solar energy to achieve deep decarbonization goals. That's roughly needing to build 10 times what we have on the system today. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, one of our sensitivities was geography and the geographic extent of the clean energy resources that will contribute to decarbonizing California could vary. So on left, we have an in-state scenario, and on the right, we have different geographic examples that we studied. A few findings stand out across all geographic scenarios. We found it's possible to build out clean energy infrastructure at scale while limiting impacts to natural lands. And one thing that was consistent across the scenarios is that a lot of new utility scale solar is selected within California, anywhere between 5 to 10 times what we have on the grid today. Next slide, please. What we found overall is that with planning, California can scale up the clean energy infrastructure needed to decarbonize through clean power and electrification while limiting impacts to natural and agricultural lands across the West. And while the study reveals it is possible, the findings also show that significant natural resources could be lost if the path to the clean energy future is not designed to be smart from the start. Investing in planning, procurement, and policy frameworks are the best way to avoid unnecessary trade-offs on the path to a clean energy future. This approach not only benefits nature, but also the pace of clean energy deployment, which I'll cover next. Next slide. To understand the economic and conservation benefits of low impact utility scale solar siting in California, TNC partnered with Eco Northwest, an economics and finance consulting firm, on the Greenlight study pictured here, which was released last year. This study found that utility scale solar energy projects built in low biodiversity areas within California had permitting timelines that were 2.5 times shorter and had fewer requirements for compensatory mitigation. So what this reveals to us is that there's not only a nature benefit, but a business benefit to a low impact approach to clean energy development. Next slide. And so how does this touch down into procurement, which we're talking about today? So integrating environmental stewardship into both planning and procurement that shapes our state's pathway to decarbonization can yield multiple benefits. The approach allows for achieving multiple environmental goals, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing air pollution, and limiting impacts to critical lands and waters. It's also aligned with sustainable development principles. And second, the approach can increase the certainty of decisions and investments through early identification of risks that might affect project viability. And it can maximize the time and cost-saving benefits that we found in the study mentioned on the previous slide. The challenge of scaling up clean energy infrastructure over the next 2 decades at the pace and scale needed to fight climate change is significant, but possible and necessary. And CCAs are uniquely positioned to influence where and how clean energy is deployed to drive a market for resources that allow for protection of critical lands and waters. And I see this in a couple of ways. CCAs are of the community and understand the needs and wants of the people they serve. These insights are important to shaping the portfolio of resources that are offered, including considerations for the environment. And second, CCAs have the flexibility to design and implement new approaches and products for their customers. Next slide, please. Now let's talk a little bit more about how we've seen this done. All electricity service providers, including CCAs, are different, and the approaches for how to integrate environmental stewardship will look different, depending on load size, service area, and the priorities of the communities you serve. With that in mind, I want to share a few points that we have learned through working with utilities, CCAs, and private corporations on procurement-related strategies over the past decade. First, it's helpful to identify the environmental values. What are the environmental goals of your community, of your entity? For example, reducing emissions, reducing pollution, protecting open space in the communities you serve. Second, using those goals to then inform how due diligence is conducted in procurement. What kind of data is needed? What kind of questions need to be asked through an RFO? And finally, really thinking through how to integrate that information into decision-making. And now I hand it off to Natasha to talk through how CPA has approached this.
Great, thanks, Erica. I want to echo this idea that incorporating environmental stewardship is both the right thing to do, but also a good business decision. Moving on to the next slide, I'll be diving into CPA selection process and how we implemented the framework that Erica just described. So prior to our first RFO, our board established this principle or mission statement that you see highlighted in orange. CPA is committed to being an environmental leader by providing customers with energy that delivers multiple benefits for air, water, and nature. And I just want to highlight a couple words here, which is leader and multiple benefits. Our evaluation criteria strives to do two things. The first is prioritize projects that are considered multiple benefit renewable energy and projects that are located in areas that have been specifically identified and zoned for renewable energy development. We also strive to deprioritize projects located in high conflict areas where we feel that the development will cause harm to the environment. And I just want to make the distinction here because there's a lot of the discussion around environmental stewardship is about avoiding causing harm, which is important. But what we wanted to do through this environmental stewardship principle was to set a higher bar and actually prioritize projects that are offering multiple benefits, which I'll describe more in more detail in the next few slides. So this shows our environmental stewardship ranking. The projects that are submitted into our solicitations are evaluated and ranked on evaluation on environmental stewardship using the rankings you see. So a project that ranks high, which is a good thing, is a project that demonstrates multiple benefits, meaning that there's additional benefits, whether they be societal, health, economic, water savings, or other environmental benefits just beyond the GHG reduction associated with being a renewable energy project. A medium is a project that is located in an area designated as a preferred renewable energy zone and has received its land use entitlement permits. A neutral is just what it sounds like. It's a project that may not necessarily demonstrate any additional benefits, but also is not in a high conflict area. And then a low is a project that is located in a high conflict area and will cause harm to the environment. And I'll note that to date, our board has not approved a project that ranks as a low on environmental stewardship. So what are some of the avoidance screens that we use? So the list here, category 1 and 2 lands identified in the Renewable Energy Transmission Initiative. Category 1 lands are those protected, are protected lands or development prohibited. Category 2 are, have land designations that protect ecological or social values. The LA County significant ecological areas, those are officially designated lands in LA County that have irreplaceable biological resources. The West Mojave Assessment for Least Conflict Solar Energy. This is a study that identifies area of high or low conservation value, and we want to stay away from those areas that have high conservation value. The Ventura County SOAR protected areas. So the SOAR initiative ensures that lands are protected for open space and agriculture. And then the Bureau of Land Management West-Wide Wind Mapper. There are specific lands that have been identified that are restricted or have resource sensitivities. So I'll just note here that some of these avoidance screens, these are statewide designations or statewide studies. And then others are specific to CPA service territory. So next slide. So multiple benefit, what does multiple benefit mean? So here are a few examples of what we identify as multiple benefit. The first is repurposed energy or industrial sites. So an example of this would be a site that was previously a gas plant that is being repurposed for a clean energy project. Projects that are located on salt-affected agricultural land. So we want to stay away from development on prime agricultural land, but for agricultural land that is not suitable for long-term agricultural use, those are good areas for clean energy development. Located on exposed salton sea playa. So these areas may help mitigate public health and wildlife impacts through new development. Projects that are located in the built environment. So these are likely smaller scale projects, but some examples would be using a warehouse rooftop for solar PV or a solar PV carport. And then the last point here, projects developed in partnership with another public agency or community organization to provide benefits for recreation, transportation, water conservation, or other public good. So an example of this might be a brownfield site that the community has determined would be better used for a recreation area and a clean energy development site. And just some examples here. So next slide. So in order to incorporate these avoidance and multiple benefit screens into our solicitation process, CPA and TNC collaborated on a web-based mapping tool to screen the project proposals. And this tool allows us to identify and map out the avoidance screens in multiple benefit areas that I just talked about. It's hosted by Databasin. And part of this, as part of the solicitation process, where bidders have to submit information to us, we ask that developers upload their GIS file of the project footprint into this Databasin tool, and then overlay the screening layers that will allow them to answer a number of questions. And the responses to these questions will objectively place the developer in a high, medium, neutral, or low environmental stewardship ranking. Next slide. So this approach, as I said, we've used it in our last 2 RFOs. It's been very successful. And I wanted to share some of the lessons learned that we've developed as we've implemented this tool and this screening process. So the first is that integrating environmental stewardship principles into procurement does benefit CPA. Not only is it the right thing to do, it's consistent with our community priorities, but it's a good business decision for us. It helps identify projects that are going to be potentially problematic and may have a high risk of failure, or identify projects that are going to be very successful. Erica spoke to this when she was presenting, but just noting here that all CCAs are different. So the approach to integrating environmental stewardship is really going to look different by CCA depending on the CCA's procurement strategies, their community priorities, how they define environmental stewardship, and their size and location. Mapping tools should be easy to use and open access for developers. So every year we're making tweaks to this process to make the process more user-friendly. Ultimately, we want developers to bid into our solicitations and have a positive experience through the RFO process. Developer responses require post-submission validation. So one of the things that we do is ask the developers to send copies of their GIS files, and we will actually go and validate every single project and the responses that they submit into the RFO to make sure that the responses are accurate. And finally, the mapping tool is helpful as a screening tool, but projects may require additional due diligence. So we do a lot of work to make sure that we know our projects. The screening tool is a great first step, but it's certainly not the full extent of the diligence that we're doing on our projects to make sure that, you know, if a project ranks high, it's really a high, and if a project is low, it's really considered a harmful project. So it's been really exciting to share my experience with you today. I'm going to turn it back to Erica to provide the audience resources for other CCAs or other procurement folks in the audience that want to learn more.
Thanks, Natasha. Can you go to the next slide, Leora? So on these two slides here, we have collected some resources that may be of interest to review after the webinar, and Leora will share more about the slides being available. But within this slide, and then Leora, can you go to the next slide? There are links to find both information about CPAs, approach to environmental stewardship. There are other resources and tools that are used in procurement. And then on this slide here in particular, we have links to a number of the studies that the Nature Conservancy has done related to energy in California. Next slide, Leora. I think I get to hand it off to you. Oh, before I do that, thank you. So if you need more information, Natasha's email is here, my email is here, and now I will hand it off to Leora.
Thanks so much, Natasha and Erica. Those were great presentations. And so we'll now start the Q&A. You can click on the Q&A button on your screen to type in your questions. Please try to use the Q&A feature rather than the chat, so we can just look in one place for questions. And I'll just start it off here. Here's a question for CPA. How are developers responding to your process? Is there a concern that the number of responses will be less robust given this process you've established?
So we've actually had an overwhelming response to our RFOs. We have hundreds of projects that bid into our solicitations. And to date, we haven't heard many complaints from developers, quite frankly, about the screening process. So we do ask them to complete a lot of questions so that we can get to know their projects better. But so far it's been working really well, and we've had a really great high participation competitive solicitations.
Great. Here's another question with regard to ag lands. What consideration have you given to ag being co-located with solar? I've read some stories indicating that these uses are more compatible than one might think.
Hi, this is Erica. So I think there's some really interesting scientific research coming out about the potential to co-locate solar with agricultural lands. For the study that I mentioned in this presentation, similar to what Natasha said, we took the approach of trying to limit impacts to prime or other important agricultural resources and think about salt affected or other impaired agricultural lands.
Okay, here's another question. You mentioned that health benefits may qualify in the may be assessed in the evaluation process. Do you have any examples of how that works and how health benefits may be taken into account as you evaluate the offers you receive?
Yeah, so from a health perspective, we think the big category here are local air quality issues, and generally the development of clean energy resources in the community are either neutral or beneficial from a local air quality perspective. Certainly we're looking kind of more holistically beyond just procurement of clean energy resources. We're looking at other areas like displacement of fossil fuel generation in our service territory. We're looking at electrification, both transportation and building electrification that would have an impact on local air quality and health. Yeah.
By using your mapping tool and knowing California needs 5 to 10 times more utility scale solar, are you finding the need for more transmission from the preferred areas? Do you incorporate the transmission land use needs into the analysis?
Hi, we did find that across, I think it was all of the scenarios that we studied, some new transmission investments were required to be able to integrate that amount of new clean energy onto the system. And so when I think about transmission from my perspective, I think that we are going to need some new strategic and well-planned transmission lines to be able to build out the resources to decarbonize. But it's also really important to think about the non-wire solutions that are available to help solve grid management and reliability challenges, and the upgrades that can be made to existing lines first. To the second question, we did incorporate the transmission land use needs into the analysis, both the amount of land required for bulk transmission and interconnection transmission. So that kind of information is available by scenario in the technical report.
Do these tools capture positive externalities from, for example, wind repowers that replace smaller turbines with fewer larger ones that are less likely to result in raptor strikes? Pretty specific there.
In the research that I mentioned, so in the particular project Power of Place, we didn't look at avian impacts from wind turbines, but the model did have repowering as a function, and so it often sought to repower, especially within California, wind resources. So it was a capability in the model, and we saw it employed and selected.
Okay, there's a question, what involvement there may have been by local community grassroots environmental organizations in the development of this screening criteria and process.
So we had a number of organizations provide input into this process. The Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, SEHA, which is an environmental justice organization. We also worked closely with IBEW Local 11, which is a electrical union in our service territory, to help define not only the environmental stewardship, but the evaluation criteria overall.
Thank you. Can you tell us more about the business case for selecting projects with lower impacts on natural resources, and how that might impact project viability and cost? Let me know if you need me to read it again.
Yeah, Erica, do you want it? Eric and I can probably both speak to this, so I can speak at a high level about the areas that are of concern to CCAs. So CCAs, we care about cost. We want to have the lowest priced projects. So we're looking for projects that are competitively priced. And if a project requires lengthy and expensive permitting processes, high compensatory mitigation measures, those can really drive up the cost of the price that those projects can offer to us. I'll also note that project success is very important. So when CCAs are signing contracts for projects, we want those projects to come online, right? Because we're using those projects to meet our compliance targets. We're using those projects to meet our customer demand. And so we want to make sure that those projects have a high likelihood of success. And the projects will be more successful if they're in areas where the area's already been zoned for renewable energy development. If the communities support the projects, they can successfully get through all of their permitting requirements. And so those are important factors for us when we select projects.
I think that was great. I don't know that I have much to add. Thanks, Natasha.
Here's an interesting one. As the climate warms, might there be environmental benefits like creating shaded habitat to having solar located even in sensitive desert areas?
So I think the way that I would think about that is, I remember the first time I heard from one of our scientists that the desert is actually an old growth landscape. We have plants that are thousands of years old. It's really ecologically fragile. And if there are impacts to intact, ecologically important desert habitat, those can take hundreds of years to recover if they're even able to recover at all, which is why in the deserts, it's so important to try to protect those areas first and really look at the areas of the desert that are already degraded or impaired, already degraded or in an impaired state. When it comes to creating shaded habitat, I have seen some research more focused on cities and communities about shade benefits. I'm less familiar with, and I haven't come across research specific to the desert environment. Thank you.
Okay, question about distributed generation. Is CPA looking into developing DG projects which would be owned by the JPA? Or you know, is it mostly going to be signing long-term PPAs with projects? Yeah,
so we're definitely looking at distributed projects. Our 2019 Clean Energy RFO actually included a distributed track that was open to projects that were less than 10 megawatts in size, and located within LA and Ventura counties, so our service territory specifically. We did select a few projects from that distributed track that we're currently negotiating PPAs with. As we move forward, we're really looking for projects, just to bring back this theme of multiple benefits. So for smaller scale projects that we're looking to contract with or develop, we're really focused on developing those within our service territory, and also projects that may have multiple benefits that they can offer our customers. So an example of that is the DAC Community Solar Program. So this is a PUC funded program that CPA, we filed an advice letter with the PUC last year to access those program funds. And hopefully if our advice letter gets approved, we will be launching a solicitation effort to develop community solar projects in DAC communities in our service territory. So that's one example. Another example is we're currently evaluating the potential of developing projects for our member agencies related to resiliency. So having on-site solar or solar plus storage or standalone storage systems that can provide backup power for critical facilities. So absolutely, we're definitely looking at distributed energy, whether that's through a PPA or owned by the JPA, or whether that's in front of the meter or behind the meter. It'll depend, but we're looking at it in a variety of ways.
Thank you. I'll just do a few more here. So this question is for Erica. Did the Nature Conservancy study consider mid-scale installations as a part of this solution, such as parking lots, large building roofs, or did it assume that large multi-acre utility scale projects is the way to go?
Good question. So the model that we used and the scenarios, they definitely considered distributed energy resources and the type of resources that you are describing. And one of the trends that we saw in the data is that as more of those type of mid-size or larger distributed energy resources are selected, it does reduce the amount of utility scale generation that's required, and thus the land footprint of those facilities. But overall, because we were exploring an electrification pathway all the way out to 2050, the load in the study was almost double what it is today. So utility scale resources still played a big part of what the model selected to build the 2050 portfolio. In addition to distributed energy resources, we did include energy efficiency, demand response, and we actually have a high distributed energy resources sensitivity, which is described in the technical report and has some interesting findings around the reduction in land footprint, but also transmission. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll make this the last one. A few people asked if the recording will be available. Yes, it will. It will be posted on the Cal CCA website. And if you're attending the webinar, you'll get an email probably on Monday that will have a link to the recording and the slides. So thank you for your interest in that. CPA, Natasha, does it have any plans to issue RFPs or to consider offshore wind or floating solar?
So our solicitations are technology agnostic, so open to all types of RPS eligible resources and different types of storage technologies. I'll note that to date, we have not received an offer for offshore wind, but their offshore wind technologies are absolutely welcome to submit and participate in our solicitations. We feel strongly that portfolio diversity is really, really important. So we want to have a portfolio of diverse technologies that generate at different parts of the day. So definitely encourage emerging technologies, offshore wind, long duration storage. We are very excited about opportunities to contract with those types of resources and hope to see them participate in our solicitations.
Okay, and with that, we'll wrap things up here. You can find more information on CCA Power Procurement on the Cal CCA website. On the impact page, you can see the address of the page there at the bottom. And on our news page, where we have the latest procurement related announcements and information resources, including some of the maps that you saw, which showed the location of the renewable energy projects that are being built to serve CCAs. We also have links to CCA solicitations on our jobs RFO page. And again, the address is down there at the bottom of the slide. We appreciate you spending your time with us today. If you would like additional information or have follow-up questions, you can reach me at leora@cal-cca.org. Stay well, everyone.